Hey guys, welcome back to Unasa TV. I know that video yesterday was pretty long, but I wanted to make sure that I didn't cut anything out so nobody could accuse me of cherry picking information. But today I wanted to talk about something else. I've been in some conversations with some other agricultural professionals in our area, people who deal with a multitude of different farms, and we were just kind of having a casual conversation about what we think may be like the biggest issues for agriculture in the near future. And some of these issues you guys have heard of, some of them have gotten a little more intense in the last few days. And so I'm going to dig a little more into one of these issues, but there's a lot going on right now. You know, when you look at water rights, for example, out west, this has been an ongoing issue for years. And then we saw the curtailment order in Idaho, and it really kind of opened a lot of people's eyes. And traditionally, you know, I may have been one of those people who said, hey, senior rights holders have senior rights. But then, you know, in recent years, what we've seen is a lot of large investment groups coming in and buying up water rights to flip them for millions of dollars worth of profit to city development and you know, things like meta data centers where you know, why do we need all these data centers anyway? It's like, I feel like we're building an infrastructure of spyware across the country, because that's, I mean, Facebook, man, they collect a lot of data on you. It's a little unnerving if you think about it. But so that, you know, water rights is definitely a big issue. The drought conditions here in the southeast, something I'll talk about once we have a little more information on it. You've had a lot of crop losses in South Carolina, a lot of crop losses in North Carolina, but to be able to measure the extent of those states and how it's going to impact the overall harvest this year, I think it's still too early to tell. There's a chance for recovery in some areas. Another issue we talked about was PFAS chemicals. You know, that is a big issue that we're going to see regulatory movement on, and I think it's going to have far-reaching impacts as they continue to figure this thing out. I don't think, you know, I haven't spoken to anybody that agrees that PFAS are good things to have around, but the reality is that they're here. They're everywhere. Mitigating that is going to be very tough. We have to kind of start with the manufacturing side. I do think it's interesting. There was a recent university study out of Texas, I believe, and they determined that there's a lot of PFAS contamination coming out of lithium batteries. And in general, kind of our green power grid, if you think about the solar panels and other things that are using products that have these chemicals in them being installed across the country and on farmland nonetheless. I don't know if you guys have ever been out to where there's a lot of wind turbines. Some of you live in those areas. Sometimes you see those turbines leaking oil, all sorts of chemicals as they spin around, and nobody comes out to fix them. A lot of the companies that install these wind turbines end up going bankrupt. They're operating off of government grants. It's completely unsustainable. And then they don't have the ability to really go out and maintain these systems. So what's going to happen to all these farmers? And they're trying to increase lease rates for solar panel installation and other things. But what's going to happen to these farms when they figure out that, you know, this infrastructure is actually causing more PFAS damage, and they're starting to implement all of these regulations against PFAS? I think that's going to be an interesting thing. I think it's going to be a ways before we see how that's going to implement out. The big thing I've been watching with that recently is the $500 million that they're requesting from and to be put into the farm bill to rebuy farmland, using the state of Maine as kind of an example of the legislation. I disagree with the government buying farmland. I think there's got to be other ways we can use those funds to mitigate the situation, but that is my personal opinion. Some of you might think it's great. I mean, why not let the government own the farmland? The other big one, the one that has kind of gone off the rails recently, as far as regulations, as far as fears of the public, is, you know, just mass media pushing a narrative. It's the avian flu H5N1. And when I get into this, you'll realize that there's now a new gain of function, which they're calling the Bovine H5N1. That's kind of just the coin term with some news agencies. But the Bovine H5N1 The whole H5N1 thing is curious to me from the get-go. I mean, I covered this bird flu back when it first started outbreaking. And if you remember from that video, I was talking about how there were a couple unusual things about it. Number one, it was impacting more species of bird than any other bird flu. It was spreading faster than our previous bird flu outbreaks. And, you know, it persisted much longer than other bird flu outbreaks with a lot of pressure. It's killed hundreds of millions of birds around the world. But we're not dealing with the same bird flu now that we were back then, because as time has progressed, we've seen different stages of gain of function within H5N1. So it started making its way into mammals, and then, you know, I was thinking, you know, last winter that we may actually be seeing a retraction of H5N1, but then we saw it starting to appear in dairy cattle, and it's spread to 12 states, over 100 I think it's getting close to 140 herds, but it's well over 100 herds of dairy cattle at this point in time that have been infected with H5N1. There's been concern from the day it got into the dairy cattle that it could eventually get into the beef cattle. Somehow this bird flu has managed to traverse states and not impact all of the beef cattle that are in between, at least not that we know of right now. The last time I did a video on this, it was just in a handful of states, and I said it was going to start spreading a lot faster because it was probably already in states that we just hadn't known about yet. And that's usually the case with a lot of these things, is it's usually in places that we just don't know about yet due to, you know, testing or symptoms showing up. A lot of these cows are asymptomatic, and I know that people have concerns about PCR tests. I have concerns about PCR tests, but I don't think, you know, even with COVID, that changed the fact that this thing was out there and that we should be aware of it and know how to handle it. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to over-regulate it. And in this video, I'm going to talk about how some states are pushing to be the next exemplary state on how the US government should over-regulate. And their overreaching, I think, can be solved in several ways. One of them is that they really need to have the farmers involved with their decision-making process. This concept of coming in and pushing these things on people, they don't necessarily work, and that's why, you know, you see articles that say farmers are resisting, like they did during COVID, to these regulations in Michigan, for example. Because Michigan right now is the most highly regulated state in the United States when it comes to bird flu. It's I believe the third largest as far as the bovine H5N1 outbreak, and they have become rather authoritarian about it. If you've watched this channel, you know that they have been investigating herd shares. They've been shutting down farm co-ops that are selling raw milk because there's a fear of bird flu getting into raw milk. To my knowledge, of the 5 cases of people getting bird flu, it hasn't been from anybody drinking milk. They have found, you know, dead or inactive bird flu cells in pasteurized milk on the shelves of grocery stores. But I had done this a while back. I had talked about the need for pasteurization versus, you know, the need not to pasteurize. And a lot of it comes down to, you know, it's kind of like when you live in a city where there's a lot of people and there's a lot of things being, I mean, I was just in New York City with my family not too long ago, and there's just a lot there that your immune system has to contend with every single day. But, you know, here home on the farm, there's not a whole lot that I run into. You know, it's just me, my family, and my animals, and that's the same for them. You know, so the raw milk industry, you know, I'm not saying that there's not a risk there, but what I am saying is that it's a lower risk that their cows are going to be infected. I don't know how this is spreading. They say that it's spread through, you know, the cattle market, somebody buying a cow, shipping it to Michigan, and then trucks coming in and out of an infected place, going to another infected place, workers going from dairy farm to dairy farm, and that could very well be it. You know, maybe that's how it's spreading. I do think that the kind of the wide spread of it, the hopping of certain states, is a little bit unusual as well. And like I said, this has always been an unusual bird flu with its abilities and gain of function from the very beginning. And there's a lot of scientists who have written articles on this from the very beginning that have said that this is not the typical strain that we're used to seeing, and now it's definitely not, because it's gone beyond things. I was reading an article the other day in Sky News that was talking about how a recent study has shown that the new bovine H5N1 virus can actually cling onto human respiratory cells, which means that they've determined now that this can spread to humans. At least one study has determined that. There's certainly a lot of fear out there. The WHO, the CDC, a lot of these organizations are working very diligently because they believe that this could turn into a human pandemic as well. In fact, the United States government has just given Moderna $176 million of US taxpayer dollars to develop a vaccine. Moderna is the best choice because their mRNA vaccine for COVID could easily be, replicated or redesigned to handle something like the bird flu. I think one of the largest problems that we're going to run into with this vaccine, even if they develop one, is that there wasn't a lot of transparency when it came to side effects of the COVID vaccine. There was a reluctancy to share all of the data with the people. And so you were asking people to put something in their arm, and when they didn't do it, you forced them to do it. I think that the biggest challenge that the industry is going to face is their lack of transparency. The lack of transparency of letting people know what could happen to them. You let people know what could happen to them because of a virus, even though a lot of those symptoms have been asymptomatic or very mild right now. You've let us know that this could be this deadly thing that infects every single organ in our body unless we take the needle. But nobody ever tells you what's in the needle. And the reason why the bird flu would be such a huge deal in the United States is because apparently it's not like a typical influenza. It actually impacts other organs. And so although all of the cases that we've seen so far have been mild, the WHO said somebody died of it in Mexico, but then the Mexican government confirmed that that was actually an incorrect statement from the WHO. The person died of other causes, but they did have bird flu at the time of death. But the point is that most of these cases have had very mild symptoms, but we should be terrified of it. There's been a lot of movement to protect the people against this bird flu. I was reading on, I think it's Stat. It's like a medical journal website. They were talking about how we need to start now preparing our schools for this H5N1 bovine bird flu pandemic. And what kind of made me chuckle this morning, and I read this, but this is how far some of this fear can go, and then I'll get into some of the regulations. I was reading this, and I don't even know how I came across it. Sometimes, I wonder myself. It must be just the way I do searches or something. But according to a letter to the editor of ETV News, I didn't even know ETV News existed. Is that like entertainment TV news? Maybe I just didn't recognize their logo. But they are calling, this is just a citizen from Connecticut, John, and he's calling for government-funded cultivated meat as a replacement for our traditional food sources. Listen to this. As avian flu runs rampant through American cattle, now dairy cows, not in beef yet. Now is the time for our political leaders to support increased public funding for cultivated meat research. For those who don't know, cultivated meat is grown from animal cells without slaughter. Since livestock are removed from the process, the risk of zoonotic viruses making the jump to humans is reduced. Despite admirable progress by the private sector, technological hurdles remain in order for the new protein to be mass-produced at an affordable price. These can be overcome with government money for cellular agricultural development. Politicians who care about public health, not to mention the environment and animal welfare, should back the effort. So this is where you're starting to see a dialogue change out of complete fear, because he's talking about meat, right? And so far, we haven't really seen bovine H5N1 in the beef industry. There was one case where they had found the virus in beef, but it turned out that that was a dairy cow that had been slaughtered and it had the virus. So, and that meat was thrown away. But this has already gotten the public so concerned, this fear of it spreading, and like I said, that so far the symptoms have been very mild, but it has the public so concerned, and I don't disagree. I mean, historically speaking, H5N1, when it does get into the human population, has been very destructive. You know, this is also, you know, a different virus, has certain gains of function as far as, you know, how it's going, and I don't think a lot of people do, as far as how it will actually impact the human population. There was another article that was talking about how if you've had previous influenza vaccines, or you've been getting them over the years, you're most likely going to be okay, because it's your immunity has been built up to it from the vaccines. Of course, that also happens with natural immunity, which they recognize in the article. And so they were saying that it may not impact the adult population as much as the younger population. So anyway, there's a lot of concern out there. And the media has been really doing everything they can to help push that narrative. You know, when the WHO came out and said somebody died of H5N1, it was all over the news before anybody actually verified that that was the cause of death, which it turns out it was not, according to Mexican officials. But I noticed recently, and this has been a pattern, if you look at NGW8's article on misinformation on me, nonetheless, at the bottom of the article, they have an entire section of that article dedicated to a warning of drinking raw milk. I noticed that ABC 13, now I haven't checked this out yet, but I'll put up the ownerships of, you know, these news stations, because I think it's important nowadays when we talk about the news to remind people of who owns these news agencies and see if there's a differentiation. At the time of recording this, I hadn't done the research, so look on the screen. But the point is that they put out an article on a similar controversial topic. That is the state of Michigan rating or going into this farm co-op. Like I said, when I initially reported on that farm co-op, and I might try and set up an interview with them just to find out how they have things structured. But a lot of farm co-ops are set up so that you are an investor of that farm and you're getting products from that farm, similar to a herd share, only it's a more diverse set of products. Instead of just a herd, you've got access to vegetables, other things, and farm co-ops can even expand that investment to multiple sources, multiple farm sources to bring them in. So in my opinion, you know, it's still, you're dealing with investors and educated consumers, not the retail market. But anyway, that article at the bottom of it, again, they put in kind of a similar pitch against drinking raw milk. And I recognize that there are, you know, they have found H5N1 in pasteurized milk on the grocery store shelf. It was inactive. And so that would insinuate that there is a risk in raw milk. A milking cow on some of these small raw dairies isn't really exposed to the magnitude of other cows. The magnitude of those other cows increases the need for antibiotics and other things. And those antibiotics and things actually help pathogens adapt and be able to grow and overcome those antibiotics. I mean, that's just the way the science works. That's why we're always having to put more chemicals into the ground or more fertilizers, because we're constantly having to adapt to nature adapting to us. Bottom line, you know, scientifically speaking, the risk of drinking raw milk is going to be different between the environments of which it came. And if that is a path that you choose and the path that you choose to take a risk on, I would encourage you to make sure that you are educated in the farming practices. This is all I'm saying. I think that the fear is being overdone. And I think that we aren't to that point yet. Fear has an interesting way of creating mandates, of creating emergencies. You know, the state of Colorado just declared a state of emergency over H5N1 last weekend, and it's yet to be seen whether the governor, Governor Polis, is actually going to, how he's going to use those mandates. I mean, the good thing about a state of emergency is it does bring in additional funding and resources to combat H5N1. So there are definitely some benefits even to the ranchers and farmers to being put into a state of emergency. The other side effect of the state of emergency is that it could give the government a little too much power, a little too much overreach. And I haven't seen the state of Colorado working very closely with farmers in the past. And so my concern is how those mandates will impact the agricultural industry, will impact those farmers, and whether or not they will be properly scientifically backed, right? You have to have the farmer input to have that knowledge. It's just not going to work, you know, without it. I mean, there's a certain practicality that the farmers understand that the government agencies don't necessarily understand. And we're seeing that right now actually in Michigan. Michigan has some of the most stringent rules. They've put in mandates left and right to try and control H5N1. They have been noted as being the example that everybody's watching to see how we can improve upon the national regulations that have been put in place to help combat H5N1. The biggest problem that they have in Michigan is that they don't have a lot of farm participants. They have about 900 dairy farms, and less than a dozen are actually participating in their programs. And even with their mandates, many of them aren't doing it, like the mandates for certain protective wear. And I think it comes down to, you know, practicality. It's not practical to ask somebody to put on goggles and all this protective gear going out in the summer heat with humidity, trying to deal with animals. It could be dangerous, number one. I mean, when your goggles are fogging up, if an animal acts a certain way, I mean, these are very big animals. They don't intend to kill anybody, but they can kill you if by accident, you know, if provoked, but also by accident. So it could be a very dangerous situation. They're not getting enough input from the farmers. And the way the farmers are reacting, as news articles will even suggest, is they're feeling like they're being put under COVID mandates, which didn't really work. And there's been a lot of evidence coming out recently that some of those were just put into place without any prior knowledge of how they would actually have an impact, positive or negative. And that's kind of the issue that we're now seeing in Michigan. So if they want to combat this thing, if they want to try and figure out how to get a handle on it, at some point in time, they've got to figure out the fact that the government doesn't know as much as the farmer knows. And they've got to figure out how to combine science with practicality in order to battle the thing. I'm hoping that Governor Polis in Colorado uses his emergency powers in the correct way, but it's still too early to tell. He just declared a state of emergency. But this is going to put the state of Colorado in a much stronger position than probably even Michigan to come up with rules, regulations, how they're going to handle it, how they're going to invest in it. And so it's very up in the air. But this is why, you know, from the time I started covering this to now, if you listen to what I said in one of my earlier videos, maybe fears is a wrong word to use. I think some people think that it's trying to instill fear in viewers, like putting out articles on drinking raw dairy and people dying of H5N1 that aren't true. But my concern, we'll put it that way, my concern is that these agencies and politicians are going to try and come in, over-regulate things using some scientific evidence, but science never works unless it's practical, right? So it could cause a lot of mayhem within the agricultural industry. And I'd really like to know, why is it that this virus is targeting dairy farms and not beef farms and everything else? And some of you might think from listening to the news, well, that's a very simple answer. You know, you've got workers coming into these environments and out of these environments, trucks moving in, moving out. You've whatever. But believe it or not, a lot of workers that work on dairy farms also transition over to beef farms. So a lot of these arguments don't necessarily work. A lot of dairy cows are sent to be finished with beef cows. And I realize at this point in time, you're probably not going to see that mixing because of federal mandates, but there's definitely not enough there to tell me that we know exactly why this virus is targeting this specific industry. You know, it's all bovine, right? The birds that are carrying this travel everywhere. Something else that has come up with the bovine H5N1, besides the possibility of human transmission, is that they've actually found that bovine H5N1 can go back to birds, and that happened with one of the largest bird producers in Michigan, and it kind of devastated that community. A lot of people lost their jobs because this bovine H5N1 made it back into, you know, one of the largest poultry producers, and, you know, wiped out a lot of birds, wiped out a lot of jobs with it. So I don't know, you guys, this is all, it's stuff that is concerning. I don't have all the answers for it. I don't think that we should approach it from the standpoint of, oh, they're doing PCR tests, the symptoms are asymptomatic half the time. This is complete bull. I think that H5N1 is something that we're really contending with. I think it's a highly unusual strain. I think it, like I said, it's had unusual gains of function from the beginning that have brought it to the point where we are now. And now, with what we've seen with recent studies, we are on the cusp of seeing that this H5N1 can spread through into at least human respiratory tracts. So this is getting on the edge. I'm not disagreeing with the CDC on that. I'm not disagreeing with the HWO on that, or WHO, sorry. I'm just simply saying that our approach this time around, unlike it was with COVID or unlike it was with these other past experiences, needs to be less government-led. And that's where I think a lot of people fall short, or a lot of these situations have fallen short in the past. They're being led by people with very little practical experience in the field. 1 to 2 years experience working on a dairy farm and going and working for the USDA, or even 5, isn't enough to develop, a strong level of practical experience. It takes years to understand the challenges that workers face in these environments, the challenges that the animals face in these environments, and then to be able to give them the science, let them see what's going on. They may even be able to help figure out where this thing is coming from a practical solution, and let them help come up with ideas that would help manage the situation. I mean, that's what we're after. We're after a way that we can manage it, get through it without it causing more havoc, without it spreading to more mammals, hopefully not humans. But I don't think that is going to happen as long as it is this government-led, big media, fear scare tactic thing that's been going on. You've got to have the participation of the farmers. You've got to have the practical knowledge of applying the science. It reminds me of something somebody said to me about applying Western science to the practicality of indigenous practices, right? When you marry the two together, you have this phenomenal result that we can understand more about agriculture. Well, the same thing goes when it comes to dealing with things like H5N1. You've got some scientific knowledge there. That scientific knowledge has very little practical knowledge of implementing anything. Farmers have the practical knowledge. If you gave them the data and maybe asked them, they may have solutions that you never thought of. They may have a much better way of getting a handle on it. Farmers, throughout history have always been geniuses when it comes to ingenuity. I mean, they have created all sorts of contraptions and machinery, and a lot of ingenuity has come from the farmers themselves, because that's what they deal with on a daily basis.